She boarded the plane quietly, blending into the moving line of passengers. No one looked twice at her. She wore a simple navy blue hoodie, a pair of black jeans, and carried a worn-out leather backpack. There was nothing about her that shouted importance. To everyone else around her, she was just another traveler trying to get to her destination on time. She found her seat, 24A, a window seat over the wing. The view wasn't special, but it was the kind of seat people liked if they wanted a bit of quiet. She slid her backpack under the seat in front of her and buckled up. Her movements were smooth and calm, like someone used to traveling often. Outside the aircraft window, the runway lights shimmered like tiny stars. It was a red-eye flight, one of those late-night journeys where people usually fell asleep as soon as the plane left the ground. The overhead lights were soft and the cabin felt peaceful, like a floating cocoon. Around her, people were settling in. A man in 24B was already putting in his headphones. A woman across the aisle was arranging her travel pillow. Flight attendants walked down the aisle with practiced smiles, checking belts and bags, gently asking passengers to switch their phones to airplane mode. She kept to herself. She wasn't the type to start small talk with strangers. Her phone was in her hand, but she wasn't scrolling through social media or texting. She looked at the lock screen for a few seconds. It had an old black and white photograph of a runway with fighter jets lined up in perfect formation. For a brief second, a soft expression crossed her face. Then she locked the phone and slid it into her pocket. The captain's voice came through the speakers, warm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We're looking at a smooth flight tonight with good weather all the way through. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The engines began to hum, a sound that always comforted her more than it bothered her. As the plane pushed back from the gate, she leaned her head slightly against the window. She had spent years hearing much louder engines. The sound of a commercial jet was almost gentle compared to what she was used to. The plane climbed into the dark sky, leaving behind the glowing city lights. As they reached cruising altitude, the cabin became quieter. Some people opened books, some pulled down their window shades, and most began to doze off. She remained still, her eyes on the wing outside. The night sky was clear. The stars were bright, and the wingtip light flashed rhythmically like a heartbeat in the dark. It was a sight she never got tired of. The silence of the sky, the calmness that came with altitude. Most passengers felt small up there, but she always felt at home. An hour into the flight, the attendants rolled carts down the aisle, offering drinks. She smiled politely and asked for water. No coffee, no soda, nothing that would attract attention. Just water. She held the cup gently and took small sips. The man next to her was half asleep, his headphones still on. A couple of rows ahead, a baby cried softly, and a flight attendant leaned over to help the young mother. A businessman typed on his laptop, the glow of the screen lighting up his serious face. Everything seemed ordinary. But outside, far beyond what any passenger could see, something unusual was happening. High above and far away, 2 sleek fighter jets were receiving new instructions. It wasn't a crisis, not even an emergency. It was something quiet but serious. A flight had appeared on a list that required extra attention, not because of danger, but because of who was on it. The woman in 24A had no intention of causing a stir. In fact, she had spent years learning how to avoid the spotlight. But sometimes the world remembers people in ways they don't expect. She closed her eyes for a moment, but she wasn't asleep. Her mind drifted, not to the future, but to memories she didn't often revisit. The sound of wind rushing past a cockpit, the firm grip of a control stick, the crisp voice of ground control in her ear. She could almost feel the weight of her old flight helmet pressing against her temples. Those years were behind her, but they hadn't left her. She opened her eyes again, grounding herself in the present. The hum of the engines reminded her where she was. She wasn't in a fighter jet anymore. She was in seat 24A, surrounded by ordinary passengers. On a peaceful night flight, then something changed. It started with a subtle movement, one of the flight. Attendants leaned toward the cockpit after receiving a small signal from the intercom. A moment later, the captain's calm voice asked the crew to remain seated for a few minutes. Nothing alarming, but something different. Outside the window, faint lights began to appear far in the distance. To the untrained eye, they were just dots in the sky. But to her, those weren't stars. Those were aircraft lights. She recognized the rhythm of their formation instantly. Her heartbeat stayed calm, but she straightened slightly in her seat. The man next to her was still half asleep. No one else seemed to notice anything. Only she could tell how close those lights were getting, how they held formation, how they moved like a well-rehearsed team, 2 fighter jets, sharp, fast, silent from that distance, had begun to escort the commercial flight. For the passengers, everything felt normal. The cabin lights were dim. Some were asleep, some were watching movies. But she knew what was happening outside. She recognized the escort pattern. She had flown it herself more times than she could count. She kept her face calm, hands folded neatly on her lap. She didn't need to look out the window anymore. She could imagine their exact position, their altitude, their speed. In the cockpit, the captain received a secure radio transmission. It wasn't something commercial pilots received often. A coded message had come in, and when the captain read the name linked to the special notice, his eyebrows lifted slightly. It wasn't fear. It was respect. One of the flight attendants quietly walked down the aisle, pretending to check on passengers. She paused near 24A for a brief second, glanced at her seat number, and then walked on. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But the woman in 24A noticed everything. She reached down to the side of her seat and adjusted the small travel tag on her backpack. The tag was old, faded from years of use. If someone looked closely, they'd see a tiny patch stitched into the fabric, a squadron emblem almost invisible under the dim light. The captain made a brief announcement, casual and friendly, as if nothing unusual was happening. He didn't mention the escort. He didn't have to. Only a handful of people in the world would ever understand what was happening, and one of them was sitting in 24A. Outside, the fighter jets held their positions like silent guardians. They weren't there to scare anyone. They were there out of respect. She glanced out the window again and caught a faint glimpse of one of the aircraft. The shape was unmistakable. She recognized the wings, the angle, the way the lights glowed softly against the night sky. For a second, memories flooded back. The rush of takeoff, the radio chatter, the tight formation flying at sunrise. She blinked and the moment was gone. The baby a few rows ahead stopped crying. The businessman shut down his laptop. The flight attendant passed by offering more drinks. To everyone else, the night was peaceful. To her, it was familiar. She leaned her head back against the seat and let out a quiet breath. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially when no one around her knew who she was. But she understood why the jets were there. She understood what her call sign still meant to people out there. Years ago, she had made a decision to leave the military world behind. She had walked away from the noise, the intensity, the endless schedules, and the weight of leadership. She wanted a quiet life, one where no one saluted, no one waited for her signal, and no one expected her to be a hero. But some names carry a kind of quiet legacy that doesn't fade. Some call signs remain etched in radio logs and training manuals, in the memories of young pilots who looked up to her long before they ever touched a cockpit. She pressed her palm lightly against the armrest. She could feel the vibration of the engines through the metal. She had spent so many nights flying through the same sky, but always from a different seat, a different angle, a different life. The flight continued smoothly, but the escort remained in the distance, silent, steady, loyal. She didn't say a word to anyone. She didn't need to the world inside that cabin. She was just a quiet woman in seat 24A. But to the world outside, in the air, she was something else entirely. And as the minutes turned into hours and the plane moved closer to its destination, she stayed calm and composed, carrying her history with the same quiet strength she always had. Little did the passengers know that the person sitting among them wasn't just a traveler. She was part of the reason those fighter jets even existed, a name whispered through radios, written in flight records, remembered by people who once learned how to fly by watching her lead the way. For now, though she let the world see her as ordinary, that's the way she liked it. But the night sky knew the truth, and so did the jets flying silently beside them. The sky was still dark when the plane began its descent. The cabin lights slowly brightened like a quiet sunrise. Passengers yawned softly, rubbed their eyes, stretched their arms. Someone opened the window shade, and a thin line of orange light peeked over the horizon. Morning was coming. The woman in 24A was already awake. She hadn't slept all night. Not because she was nervous, but because she didn't need to. Years of early flights, long missions, and silent skies had trained her to be alert, calm, and steady. She watched as the clouds outside turned golden. It was a beautiful sight, the kind of beauty that could stop time if you let it. No one around her knew that just a few miles away, 2 fighter jets were still flying in perfect formation. Their path had been quiet and disciplined all night. They had stayed far enough to be invisible to passengers but close enough to be present, like silent protectors. The plane began to lower through the clouds, and the soft feeling of descent filled the cabin. Some people held their seat rests, some closed their eyes. For most, this was just another ordinary landing. But for the woman in 24A, the sky felt like a language only she understood. She leaned her head slightly, looking out. For a moment, through a break in the clouds, she caught a clear glimpse of the sleek shape of one jet. She knew its make, its sound, its movements. She had flown with aircraft like that many times before. It was strange to see it from this side of the window, from the inside of a passenger plane instead of a cockpit. The engines slowed, the wheels extended, and the ground appeared below like a living map. Roads, rooftops, and runways came into view. The city stretched out like a giant waiting for the day to begin. Then something subtle but unmistakable happened. As the plane lined up with the runway, the 2 fighter jets pulled slightly ahead and then peeled away in perfect synchronization. It was a quiet salute. They didn't need to say a word. She understood everything in that single move. She exhaled softly. It wasn't pride that filled her chest, and it was something quieter. A deep warm wave of memory and meaning. A reminder of the world she once belonged to, and the people who still carried her call sign in their hearts. The plane touched down smoothly. A light bump, then the wheels rolled fast against the runway. A few people clapped softly, as passengers sometimes do when the landing is smooth. She smiled faintly. She had landed in rougher conditions hundreds of times. This was gentle. As the plane slowed and turned toward the gate, she could feel something shifting. Not the plane itself, but the atmosphere around her. The captain made a standard announcement about the arrival time and weather. But there was a tiny pause in his voice when he added, "We'd like to welcome a special passenger today." Heads turned. People looked around, curious. But the captain didn't give a name. He didn't need to. She stayed still, her hands resting quietly on her lap. She wasn't someone who liked attention. She had spent years keeping her life away from the spotlight. But sometimes the world finds its way to you anyway. The seatbelt sign turned off with a soft sound. People began reaching for overhead bins. Bags were unzipped, jackets pulled on. The woman in 24A remained seated. She didn't rush. She never rushed. Then the door opened, but not in the usual way. Before any passenger could leave, 2 uniformed personnel entered the plane. Their presence was calm, respectful, and precise. They didn't look nervous. They looked purposeful. The flight attendants straightened their posture slightly, as if they understood this wasn't a random check. A quiet hush fell over the front rows. People paused in the aisle, unsure of what was happening. The 2 uniformed airmen walked down the aisle with quiet steps. They didn't stop in first class. They didn't stop in business. They walked straight to row 24. Their eyes didn't wander. They knew exactly who they were here for. When they reached her seat, one of them spoke softly. He didn't use her name. He used something else. Something only a few people in the world would recognize. Her call sign. The sound of it was like opening a door that had been locked for years. The passengers nearby had no idea what it meant. It sounded like just a word to them. But to the 2 men standing there, it was more than that. It was history. It was respect. It was honor. She looked up at them, her eyes steady, calm, and warm. For a moment, no one moved. Then she nodded gently, and they stepped slightly aside to give her space. She rose slowly, sliding her backpack strap over her shoulder. The passengers around her looked curious, some even surprised. Who was she? Why were these uniformed men standing so straight? But no one asked. They just watched in silence. As she walked down the aisle, the crew members stood a little taller. Even the captain came out of the cockpit and gave a small, respectful nod. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't part of any airline procedure. It was something deeper. When she stepped off the plane and into the bright morning light, the air felt fresh and open. And there, just a few feet from the jet bridge, were 2 fighter pilots still in their flight suits. They stood straight, not with arrogance, but with quiet respect. The moment they saw her, both of them raised their hands in a sharp salute. It wasn't a forced gesture. It was something genuine, a message that said, "We know who you are. We remember what you've done." She didn't crave attention, and she didn't live for recognition. But that small moment touched her in a place words couldn't reach. She stopped, looked at them, and gave a simple nod in return. She didn't need to salute back. Her presence was enough. The young pilots looked like they were in their late 20s. They probably grew up hearing stories about people like her. For them, her call sign wasn't just a name. It was part of the airbase stories passed down in training rooms, part of the legacy of those who came before. One of the pilots, the taller one, lowered his salute and quietly said something. She couldn't hear all of it, but she recognized the tone. Gratitude, admiration, respect. She smiled gently. "Keep flying," she said softly, almost like a whisper. He nodded. She didn't stay long. She didn't need a ceremony. She didn't need a crowd. She simply walked past them, down the jet bridge, blending once again into the world of ordinary travelers. But the feeling she left behind didn't fade with her steps. The two pilots remained standing there for a few more seconds, their faces still carrying the quiet weight of what had just happened. Outside, the morning light had grown brighter. The sky that once held fighter jets and a commercial plane together was now just a soft blue canvas. Passengers exited the terminal, dragging suitcases, checking phones, calling taxis. No one really understood what had just happened, except a few. She walked with calm steps through the airport terminal. People passed her, busy with their own lives, unaware of the small history that had just been written quietly at Gate 12. Her call sign had done something unusual that morning. It had made some of the most disciplined pilots in the Air Force pause. It had reminded them why they wore their uniforms. It had reminded them that behind every name in their training manuals there was a real person who once led the way. As she reached the exit, she pulled her hoodie's hood up and adjusted the strap of her backpack. She didn't need recognition. She didn't want a spotlight. She was content to walk away quietly like she had arrived. But deep inside, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A soft, warm spark. Not the thrill of a mission, not the rush of a takeoff, but something simpler. The knowledge that even though she had stepped out of that world hadn't forgotten her. She found a quiet bench outside, sat down, and watched as planes took off one after another. The sound of engines filled the air. People came and went around her. None of them knew that a living legend was sitting among them, drinking a cup of coffee like any other traveler. Her fingers brushed against the small embroidered patch on her backpack, the same emblem she had carried for years. She didn't wear her uniform anymore, but she didn't need to. Her story lived in the skies. Far above, two fighter jets were returning to their base. Their flight path was silent, but if anyone could have heard their pilots talk, they would have heard quiet words of respect. Words about the woman in seat 24A. She closed her eyes for a second, letting the warmth of the sun touch her face. Life had changed. The world had moved forward. But some things, like respect, legacy, and quiet strength, never really faded. Her call sign was more than just a name. It was a story that would keep living in the skies long after this day. And as the morning grew brighter, she stood up and walked away, disappearing into the crowd like just another face in the city. But to the few who knew, she was unforgettable. Seat 24A would be just another seat to most people, but to those who witnessed that morning, it would forever be the seat where a story quietly took flight.